let's start by saluting the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Mrs. Cron, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Casper?
Here.
Mr. Deming?
Here.
Mrs. Miller? Here. Mr. Vergona?
Here.
Mr. Sarnes?
Here.
Mr. Schmidt?
Here.
Mr. Thompson?
Here.
Mrs. Yardley? Here. Dr. Yarnell?
Here. Thank you. At this point, we will have comments or questions from guests. I understand that there is at least one person who signed up for more. Thank you. Mr. Linden,
Thank you.
please give us your name and the municipality in which you reside.
Robert Linden, West Rockwell Township. I have comments and questions about item C4 on the agenda. I was pleased when the school district decided to use public surplus as a means of disposing of surplus equipment and not using the PSD website, which no one looked at. But now this motion here looks like you want to circumvent the public auction by allowing Book Boys, and I assume that's a company. And if that's a local company, then I assume it's Book Boys. The Book Boys out of Pottstown, which consists of one person. So it might be Book Boy, I don't know. Anyway, I don't think that's ethical. That's like a favoritism to let somebody come in and cherry pick the books and then put them out for public surplus. I would like, if you're going to do this, if you pass this motion, I want the opportunity to bid against this person. My money is just as good as his. And I'll outbid him. Thank you.
You're welcome. Hopefully, Mr. Casper, when we get to the facilities, can you comment on this question? Or Mrs.
Well, we didn't spend a lot of time on the Book Boys in our facilities meeting, so maybe we're gonna have to spend a little time on it. I think they're just another vendor added to the list. They're not the exclusive person. Is that all right? Dr. Yarnell?
Please, Mrs. Johnson.
Actually, when we discussed textbooks previously, our first mode of disposing of the textbooks is first to offer them to a book reseller, and that was Follett at the time. So Follett is the first one that comes in and reviews the books, textbooks. Then there's the next one is the Book Boys. They asked if they could review them after Follett. And after that, we were putting them out to public surplus. I will tell you that we get very little money, if any, for books that we have put out on public surplus.
Thank you. Anyone else who wishes to comment on the agenda before we start? If not, we'll move to the agenda. So the first item is the consent calendar, items A through K. Do board members have any specific items that they would like voted on separately? If not, do I have a motion to approve the consent calendar as listed? A second? Moved by Mr. Deming and seconded by Mr. Thompson to approve the consent calendar. Comments or questions from board members? I would note that there are an addendum to the superintendent's personnel report and a revision to the addendum to the superintendent's personnel report that are on the desk tonight. So I assume, is the motion still acceptable, Mr. Deming and Mr. Thompson? Okay, if there are no further questions, all those in favor?
I have a question.
Sorry, Mrs. Yardley?
I'm sorry. Yeah, and on this addendum that we just got, it says,
Could you use the microphone, because someone will say they can't hear it, so probably it's best to do that.
yeah, on the addendum that we just got tonight, it has Christopher Brockman, and it says another district position. So I'm wondering what that is.
Mr. Scarpintonio, can you respond to that?
Chris Brockman is going to be the acting teacher on special assignment for media and technology integration. I'm not sure why it was worded that way on the agenda.
Is that
I
a new
think-
position?
This is Yardley. I think you're looking at the person who's going to be replacing him. Is that on page 2 as well? Page 1 and page 2? So they're both combined.
Oh, okay. So there's 2 addendum As. Okay, fine, thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry, yes, one was corrected, proposed the second, but proposed the first one. Any other comments or questions? If not, all those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 9-0. At this point, I'd like to make some comments. First of all, we've had 2 meetings where Mrs. Johnson has presented the initial view of the budget. And there has been some confusion, I believe, in terms of what the understanding is from the public. So I thought I would try to clarify that, or perhaps confuse it further, but I will try to clarify it. And one of the items that I noted was the budget is one thing, but we were also discussing in the same time frame, and we'll be discussing further in the foreseeable future, 2 potential bond issues. And bond issues affect the budget, but they are not the budget. They are completely separate. And what happens is bond issues are public offerings that we go out and get a firm to do for us. And right now, the interest rates, as most people know, anybody who has a savings account knows the interest rates are terrible for savers, but they're good for entities and individuals who are borrowing money because of the low interest rate. These would be something that would be paid back over a period of 20 or 30 years. And so they do have an effect on each year's budget. And the one that we have talked about most, perhaps, is the one for the vocational school renovations. And that is a not-to-exceed $23 million bond issue. And of that, part will be paid by each of the 3 sending schools. The Penridge part, which depends on the assessed valuation in the Penridge School District relative to the assessed valuations in the other school districts, is about 47% of that number. So of the 23 million, something like 11 million is our share. If you go out for a bond issue, then you have to add interest to that, and it turns out to be something on the order of $14 million. But it is paid back over 20 or 30 years, depending on how the bond issue is structured. And so it means something on the order of $500,000 a year to the budget itself. The other item of this type that we talked about was a potential bond issue for future capital projects. In the past few years, we've paid for those capital project renovations and various other upgrades in the school system through surplus from the fund balance. Obviously, that's running low with our current financial situation. And so if we want to continue to do that, we probably will have to seek another source of funding, and that's the discussion. And no decision has been made about that. That's something the board gets to make a decision on somewhere down the road, whether we want to borrow it or do the projects in that way. The other thing I wanted to comment on were negotiations, or are negotiations. As you know, we are currently in the process of negotiating with the support staff. Those negotiations will resume tonight. We have 2 motions on the agenda to approve labor negotiators. If those are approved, then we will be going forward with contract negotiations with the support staff, and we have begun contract negotiations with our teaching staff as well. We've had 1 meeting, basically it was a meet and greet to lay down ground rules and discuss that. I have appointed a committee to do the negotiations on behalf of the board and administration with the teachers group. That committee will be, Mr. Casper will chair that, and I hope in future meetings, Mr. Casper, that you can report, just basic structure of what goes on for those meetings. Mr. Thompson, Mr. Deming, and Mr. Ragomo are also members of that committee. So I thank them all for, quote, volunteering, unquote, and helping the board and the district out in this regard. It's obviously an important issue. The third thing that I want to comment on, maybe perhaps somewhat serendipitously, is some of you know that I have run off to China recently. I just wanted to comment on my impressions of education in China. It's a very interesting topic, and it's one we see in the newspapers often cited for the fact that they do so well on the standardized testing. And indeed, when I was in Shanghai, we drove past the Shanghai Elementary School that had scored #1 in the most recent round of this kind of testing. Surprisingly enough, it's in an extremely affluent section of Shanghai. I don't know whether that's by chance or by design, but that just is an observation. Otherwise, it's kind of a plain vanilla type of school. Of course, as some of you know, school there is 220 days a year for students, and longer days than we typically have here. Because of the longer days and longer years, they effectively go to school for perhaps 16 years in their elementary and middle school and high school education. But it's interesting that you hear another side of this too. I met with and did some training with our distributor, our primary distributor in Shenzhen. Now, most of you know Shenzhen is the place where the iPhone's made. And it's another very go-go city. It's one of these special economic zones in a communist country that's more capitalist than anywhere I know around here. It's a fascinating place. Mercedes, Audis, whatever kind of fancy car you want, they're there. The high-rise buildings all over the place. Lots of great restaurants, etc. But this gentleman who runs a $20 million business happens to believe that his 2 children, he has 2 daughters, which in itself is a little unusual in China, but that his children will get a better education in Canada or in the States. But his wife and children live in Canada so that they can get an education. So not everyone in China, and it's obviously very anecdotal, but not everyone in China believes that their system is a better system of education. The other thing that I wanted to comment on was I have been giving lectures in nuclear plants, which is dangerous in its own right, but when I give them in English, and I have the gentleman who chairs our efforts in China beside me he's very good at English, but he also speaks, obviously, Chinese as a native speaker, and he translates for me. And I did this on 4 different plants on one of my recent visits, and on the 4th tour, or the 4th plant, one of the young men who was sitting at the table, before I even started to talk, said, "You don't need to have a translator. You can talk in English, and we'll respond." And I thought, well, this is going to be easy. I'm going to talk in English, and nobody will have anything to say. Absolutely dead wrong. Not only were there questions, there were excellent questions. I was quite impressed. Clearly, their English skills are very good, especially the younger generations, the people who have studied this for years and years. I don't know what that says to us, but to me it says that there's a lot of effort being placed there to understand what's going on. And obviously to get more of our money, perhaps, right? Because that's something they do very well. So I just wanted to comment on those things. At this point, we'll go to the superintendent's report. I'm sure she has more substantive things to say.